Hi, everyone. Welcome to TezTalks Radio. I'm your host, Marissa True. And on today's episode, we are joined by Skye Nicolas, a prominent digital and new media artist from the Philippines, but based in New York City, I believe. Skye is also a prominent Tezos artist, and his works have been included in the Tezos Foundation Permanent Art Collection that was curated by none other than Misan Haraman. So, first of all, welcome, Nicolas. It's a pleasure to have you on. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to our conversation all week.
So there's a lot for us to cover, as indicated by our pre-interview conversation. But before we dig into, your vast portfolio of work, we always start off our conversations with the story behind your entry into blockchain and more specifically Tezos. But with you, I'd like to start, I guess, one step behind that and more into your journey as an artist. So can you tell us a bit more about your personal background?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Philippines. Um, Basically, I went to art school. I was one of the, many people like back then. This is around the mid '90s. I went to the University of the Philippines. One of the few artists that got into the very tight program. I'm not sure how it is now. And on my second year, I just decided that, um, historically and culturally there was a lot of transition going on in the Philippines at that time, politically and everything. And I was one of those wild child kids who had like long hair and everything. And being a conservative country, it's still predominantly a very conservative Catholic country. And at that time it wasn't as accepting as it is today. Today they have wonderful laws that protect, for example, LGBTQ individuals and all that. Like it's a more progressive way of kind of moving on with the times. But then it was almost like a dangerous place, and so I just thought of packing my bags and a suitcase and $500, heading off to wherever. At the time, I was in a pop band. I was in a teen pop band, and my friend who was the keyboardist of the band, his father had pushed him to go to Pepperdine University for art for law school, and so he's like, "Hey, why don't you come over?" And what was a visit turned out to be a great adventure. So I haven't ever since 1996. I landed in New York, and it's been quite an adventure since. I mean, it's like a almost like a great American, not or like an A24 film or a novel of sorts, because it's full of adventure. But yeah.
So you've had obviously a very colorful history from the moment you left the Philippines to now. If you're starting from, you know, pop band beginnings and
Yeah.
you're now a globally recognized artist. And I think your rebellious history or counterculture history sort of blends very nicely into the narrative of this world of blockchain based art. And so, can you tell us a bit more about how you actually got into the NFT art scene and your journey into the Tezos ecosystem specifically?
Yeah, funnily enough, I've been so ever since I've been creating art, even New York. I went through bands, stages. I had bands, and it was a very creative community. As a The thing about New York, it's such a beautiful place where, you know, uh, in the late '90s to the early 2000s, it was pre social media. So you had, cell phones and all that. And so there was such, I think it was the last leg of a really fertile ground for, creation and just being an artist, and allowing you to meet so many creatives to be inspired by. And so I've been creating, art since, for the last 2 decades. And funnily enough, I think a lot of blockchain, NFTs and blockchain was accelerated during COVID. And so during COVID, we were all at home, and I was listening to a lot of podcasts, just trying to do my best to kind of just expand the mind. And as we usually do a lot of reading. And I had heard, NFT technology. This was in late 2020. And I started going to Clubhouse, and I hung out in the Clubhouse rooms, and I got to meet a lot of, all these gallerists who were all also trying to figure out what this NFT technology was. And so I was just an observer, for a while, and then I just well, first, I had minted my first work on ETH, on Ethereum. I mean, that was the first foray into blockchain. But then uh, I'm not so sure where I heard about it. For sure it was on Clubhouse, but I had discovered Hikanunk, and that was the first foray into Tezos. And it really excited me. You were speaking about like this sort of like rebelliousness, or just like sort of like cool indie approach to culture, and I felt that's what Hikanunk was. It was a very underground scene, full of just, it was just so raw, and it reminded me of like very like early 2000 works in Tumblr, like a lot of
Hmm.
animated gifs on Tumblr, and and that was it. Further investigations into Tezos. Um, of course, there was obviously the low barrier of entry, and there were a lot of these other, when Twitter Spaces started, uh, a lot of I was hearing a lot of Southeast Asian countries. Most of these artists didn't have the funds to even mint their own artworks. I remember there were even organizations that were helping offer, mint their artworks, and I think that was one of the primary things that really drew me to Tezos, and I felt it was a more it had more empathy. I felt, because
Hmm.
then all these people getting so excited, and on the Ethereum side, and
I,
so
I think it's super interesting to hear how everyone sort of ventured into this space, particularly for artists, because I think, like you, many people consumed a lot of media during the course of the pandemic when NFTs really started to become a dominant part of the discourse, especially as it related to art. And translating, this concept or this novel idea into actually starting to engage with it and starting to practice by minting your own piece and experimenting and introducing yourself to different ecosystems, I think was very unique to the creative community, because I think it was quite immediate, this sense of opportunity of engaging with people in a completely different and novel way. And
absolutely,
then
yeah.
and I agree with you, like the sense of culture that was immediately apparent on Tezos, especially with, the creation of the Hicket Nunk platform and community, and the fact that because the barrier to entry was so low, with virtually like very, very minimal gas fees, it meant that there was almost a supportive atmosphere, because it didn't cost anyone too much to help someone else along and introduce them to the space, particularly when it came to, emerging artists from developing economies, particularly that in Southeast Asia. So I think it's a beautiful story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even to this day, I think, Tezos is the choice chain for, like, let's say, developing countries such as the Philippines. I myself participate, and often a guest in some of these Twitter spaces where a lot of these artists converge, and it just makes sense, the frictionless transactions and the minting and all of that. It just makes so much sense, and it's just unfortunate that now I mean, currently within the last few weeks, there's all this. I feel it's just sort of like it was inevitable, because there's a lot of vested financial interests within crypto, and that's a different
Hmm.
part of the culture. And I feel like, um, whereas there are people who have sort of like, these disparaging notions about Tezos, just because they don't see it as sort of like you know a chain that it's sort of like they haven't figured out how it's been so um it's how should I say, it's kind of like the what helped create fertile ground for creation within communities, and rightfully so, I guess, because they're so focused on the finance aspect of things instead of like the creative sort of the creative economy, if you'd like to call it, that Tezos has organically just allowed for these communities to sprout.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's when you have something like cryptocurrency and the volatility of that market at the moment, and then sweeping up all of the activity that's happened within the arts and culture space and treating them wrongfully as the same thing, it's made it a very
It's messy.
tricky. Yeah, it's a very messy environment to be in. And then when you couple that with the tribalism that often comes with the way people engage with different blockchains, it's there's no clean lines for anybody. And I think that's the point at which artists sort of double down on their creative focus, and they continue to generate beautiful works, and they tend to speak for themselves because they transcend, the movements of the market, and they focus more on whether it's the aesthetic or the purpose of the piece. And it's beautiful to see that it hasn't slowed down creativity. If
Yeah.
anything, I think it may have accelerated it. But
Mm.
I think what people often find themselves being nervous about is the potential for that work to be recognized when people are fighting off on the
Yeah.
other side of the room.
That can be
How
difficult.
is how has this market volatility across the crypto space in general affected, the way in which you work?
I think it's like you were saying, right? I think there are those people, artists who are truly focused on bettering their work, on exploring, as an there are two things, right? I mean, you know, uh you would have to lie to yourself if you didn't say that as part of being an artist you would hope to be successful, because the dream is, I mean, when you're much younger, you think of, it's almost like being in a band. You want to get signed to a record label. An artist would like to be represented by a gallery, and all sorts of things follow through. But really, as as reality kicks in, as you've been doing this for so many years, you realize that, being afforded, having the privilege to create art itself, that's something that you should be grateful for, and a true art, I believe, like, you know, artists who will, accrue um, true value are those who see the long-term game. As they say, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And so you just have to, you know really focus on the long term, and trying to explore, like I say, uh, try to locate the boundaries before you push them, kind of thing,
Yeah.
right?
And I mean, not to, because I don't really want to focus this conversation on, the volatility of the crypto market and how it
Yeah.
impacts artists, because I think there's so much richness in your work that I think
Thank
we
you.
have to do justice for in this conversation. And so, throughout this chat, I want to dig a little deeper into the ways in which your work acts as a critical commentary on a lot of the technology that we're engaging with, particularly the relationship between art, culture, and technology itself.
Yeah.
And I was exploring your works over the last couple of weeks, and I know that much of your work focuses on this concept of nostalgia in relation to technologies.
Mm.
So I wanted to ask you more about how you see the role of memory as it evolves, in the post-internet age. What does it represent to you?
Yeah, that it's really interesting, right? Because a lot of people, as they say, they've been critical. There's a lot of critical, things going on within Twitter land. Twitter, for those who are watching or listening, Twitter is most of like where we congregate, within the NFT space and all. And there are certain sayings that, if nostalgia is one of those lazy things that you use if you want to sell some kind of artwork, because it's the easiest and most accessible kind of thing that pulls an emotion, right? But for many, even pre NFTs and all that, I've always just used nostalgia as sort of like, um, a catalyst or something that flavors the work to basically explore, as you said, memory in the post-internet age. And as I've said, and I've been quoted to say in interviews, nostalgia, is more than just longing for an idealized past, but it's a blueprint to better understand these powerful forces and events that basically shape our present selves. It's not just something that eases the trauma of the present, but like as you said earlier, our pre-conversation, that it's interesting that now we've assimilated so much with technology that it has become part of, you know, is it truly documenting our lives? Like we don't know, because we've given so much of our we've given away, in a way, a lot of our agency into these technologies, that we just trust them because now they are always omnipresent, and they're always there, just documenting our lives. One thing I'd like to add that's really interesting: recently, a friend of mine, I was on a phone call, and he told me that it was really fascinating. He said that he has an old phone, and he was so frustrated that he said half of his life is in his phone, and that all his memories are now locked in the phone that he cannot have access to. And I found that so, you have to take quite some time to realize what has just been said by this person who is frustrated, that thinking that I'll never, because like back then we all had analog stuff. We just had, photo albums and all that kind of thing. And it's a completely different way of even kind of socializing with those, with people within our periphery, our immediate family and all that. But now we, you know, as we assimilate with technology, it seems that we now create these dream worlds because we are kind of in our own little curated bubbles. We are not living in the same timeline as everyone. I can ask you, for example, like ask you, what you've been listening to, or, in your playlist, or what movies have you watched, and for sure it's going to be completely different than mine. Whereas in the pre-internet, everybody seemed to live in the same timeline because you were
Mhm.
given such a small amount of choices. Like I remember when I was a child in the Philippines, we had 5 TV channels. And so the whole nation watched the same program at a certain time and everything. And so that's what I mean by living in the same timeline. Whereas now it's so science fiction like, because
Mm.
everybody is sort of like living this curated version of themselves, like that they project onto social media, highlight reels that are basically being shown on Instagram. You really don't get a full sense of the person because they're giving you kind of like their idea. It's like a small kind of bite-sized overview of how they want to be perceived, and hence you have avatars and all that stuff. And so a lot of this interfacing with technology shows up in my work, and that's what I've been curious about um, for most of this. Basically, this transmedia, what I call, a transmedia consciousness, because everything is in history. History is all about telling a story, whether through cave paintings or when we through archaeology we discover all kinds of artifacts that tell a story. But now
Mhm.
we are telling story through technology, through content, through videos, through like this. We have a conversation and whatnot. But then again, you could change narratives now, and which I think we're still not. We're still beginning to see sort of like the pros and cons of all of this technology that I'm not sure we're ready for. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think when we speak of nostalgia, people have a very push and pull relationship with technology's role within it, because when you speak of nostalgia in an offline sense, I think most people long for a simpler time where they weren't burdened by, so many different social media platforms that they feel compelled to update and like demonstrate their online presence with. But at the same time, the ability to digitize memories in
Yeah.
a way that gives them a greater sense of permanence, or at least increases their sense of accessibility in the way that I can be on the other side of the world and still access a childhood photo that I've uploaded to the cloud versus having to physically go back and look at the album, has provided people with a greater sense of comfort and security. But at the same time, exactly as you said, when you consider the ways in which memory has been digitized, it suggests a lot about our sense of inherent trust in the technology that we've built to not only archive it, but to also protect it and keep it neutral in a way, and also keep it private to us, which is why I think people are having these deep introspective conversations about their relationship to technology and what it means for the preservation of the things that sentimentally hold a lot more value that isn't inherently supposed to be digital. And then, to bring this into blockchain being a key example, we speak of, we have terminology like digital provenance. And
Mm.
the core principle of that is, having a verifiable and single source of truth. And that, again, implies a deep level of inherent trust in the system that we have
Yes.
designed. And so, how does that how do you see that as an artist? Because I know this is also a theme that you have explored in your work. With the existence of so many different blockchains and so many different marketplaces, there's almost potentially this dilution of a single source of truth. So how do you convey that sort of theme through your works?
Yeah, like one thing I'd like to add, post-internet age, people don't realize that, because okay, one component of the work, an ingredient in the work that, that I use a lot, I do a lot of appropriation. And a lot of people um, don't quite understand or, respect, I guess, appropriation because they think it's simply copying, right? But if you were to think about this from sort of a topic that we're talking about, memory in the post-internet age, we must realize that the internet itself represents, it's pretty profound to think that it is our collective memory, right? Like that is pretty, that's already pretty heavy to think about, because as you said, you have one childhood photo that's been uploaded to the cloud that you can access if you have access to it, whatnot. But then again, now you have technologies like ChatGPT that's mining all of these things, in which makes it available to everything. I mean, everyone. And so, you know, um, I think, like in my work, like that you see a lot of I call it like a distillation process, because I explore a lot of using a lot of this cold source material, but then again, yeah, to understand the appropriation process, for example, I always tell people it's like a good hip hop song. A good hip hop song, you have sampled material, in which the sampled material, let's say a phrase or a beat, it's 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 often it's unaltered. It's unaltered. That's why it's so easily recognizable, but then the artist gives it um, a different role, within the composition. So it's given this new function. Although it's unaltered, it's given this new function, and that in itself is transformative. So just wrapping up, good appropriation is transformative because it adds new layers to it being recontextualized, in music, like let's say, sonically, and just even adds to the storyline or the mythology of the material it was borrowing from, or taking from. So it changes meaning. And this is what I mean by, there's so many profound layers onto this. It's just not culling source material from the internet, but the recontextualizing, and the it's a fluid kind of stream of consciousness where, you know, meaning is always being questioned, and hence that's what the postmodern is. You know, there's no, it's not always a very static or kind of solid amount of facts or whatnot. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think when you look at this notion, again, to bring it back to this idea of digital provenance and a single source of truth, it's more about the raw material
yeah,
and that static source material, as you were saying.
yeah,
But the meaning or the relevance or the context that is attached to that source material is very much subject to interpretation, which is why
exactly,
I find this idea of the internet acting as a sort of collective consciousness a very interesting notion, because I would say that, I mean, historically, you know, if you look at, for example, holy literature,
yes,
there was no neutrality in that, because society would then apply its own interpretations, and that would set up the framework for many communities. And then when you bring that tangentially, admittedly, all the way back to this concept of the fact that we're dealing with different blockchains, it almost seems to suggest that different blockchains represent differentiated realities,
yes,
because the ecosystem that exists on Tezos is an entirely different world to that of Ethereum or
yeah,
Solana or Algorand, anything else. So how do
different
you?
culture, different culture, different participants obviously will basically assert their own values onto it, you know. And basically, I mean, but that is the beauty of art as well, you know. I mean, you don't dictate any kind of sort of narrative into the viewer, and so the viewer is obviously there to explore with you. But I do think, you know, good art is all about, in my opinion, you know, if I was to use technology as sort of like you know, um, uh, you know, as an example, I would say that good art is almost like a, it's like a good data transfer between the artist and the viewer, because I do feel, and you know, this can be sort of like a mystical view, whether it's a metaphysical mystical view, let's say a philosophical view, you know. It, I think everything, whether it's objects or or dematerialized data, like, you know, like digital data, there's a lot of stuff, information embedded into those things. And I feel like good art um, allows the viewer to access what is embedded in those artifacts, you know. And I also sort of like say that whenever, you know, it's part of my production process. Like when I appropriate things, I carefully choose those ingredients, and I don't really touch them as much, because I believe that what is embedded in that, you know, and then I add whatever, you know, whatever thoughts, emotion. I trust that within the process of the creation process, I embed my own thing into that. And I
Mhm.
think, you know, with its simplicity, with its honesty, without over, you know, dressing it up conceptually, I think it comes across. So
So
yeah,
would you say that in using appropriation of material, you essentially take something that could be considered fairly neutral, that gives you opportunity as an artist to project a feeling
yeah,
onto, but also gives enough margin for the viewer to consume it differently to however you may have intended?
absolutely, yeah. And you know, basically, you're giving, you're, I feel as an artist, you're just starting a conversation in which they participate in. You know, you are presenting a topic through whatever art that you are presenting, and they have a dialogue with you. And I think that, you know, that is, those are prerequisites for good art, because, you know, when people ask, you know, what is art history, that is art history. Art history is basically a dialogue. It's an ongoing dialogue between past and present, and a future possibility. So if you have anything um, relevant or of value to add to that conversation, then you would transcend and be added to the canon of greater art history conversation.
But I think what's also interesting is that when we consider art within the blockchain and NFT space,
Yeah,
it's always bound to understanding the notion of value or the transactability of the piece itself, which I think
yeah,
is tricky to navigate because of how it can dilute the significance, the meaning, or the statement that the art piece is trying to make. But one thing I wanted to discuss with you is this notion of digital value, because something as simple as evaluating the way in which art is appraised if minted across different chains and marketplaces, they are treated differently. And that is such an interesting concept because it isn't about the perception of the piece, it's about the perception of where the piece is seen or where the piece is consumed. And I'm asking this in relation to your cross platform or cross NFT platform work. So you had this artwork is worth
on,
more on super rare, then
yeah,
this artwork is worth less on
on
foundation, and then
foundation.
this artwork is sovereign.
Yeah,
So why do you think art is treated so differently across these different platforms?
I think I think that's fundamental to even just our lives IRL, whereas why is an artwork treated less when it's in a flea market versus artwork that is in a gallery? And there have been artworks like, for example, installation art that's like been outside the gallery, like for example, like if you had trash bags, like just these black trash bags outside of the gallery, versus if you put it inside, then it is now elevated into something, and people who are not sure of what that is, wouldn't want to even ask the question or even bother.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
thing is, it all boils down to context and just the sort of like cultural parameters within certain systems. A gallery is a system. you know a flea market is a societal, it's a system within our society, right? So the grocery is a system. So it's just every system has its own function and all that. And and at the beginning, blockchain, certain people during COVID basically congregated somewhere, and yeah, they created these micro communities in which certain values were sort of agreed upon. And hence now we sort of have the ETH versus ETH. I mean, ETH versus Tezos kind of thing, or where is authentic art being minted, and all those questions, which I think
Hmm.
is great, because these are debates, and I feel there is a dearth of um, of 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 good discussion, even in art. Like, I feel that there is no art criticism, and I think it's very crucial, because although there are great artworks being minted, I feel there's not enough art discussions being had to contextualize the work, and to always, for work to be relevant, it needs to always be talked about. People have to know what it is. I mean, I think it was a good step for the Tezos Foundation to um, start building its permanent collection. But I think part of the their role now is to, throughout these next couple of years, to have shows, to have discussions, to have all kinds of education, so that people may enjoy the art and learn about them, and also invite some kind of patronage, and more collectors to participate within the scene, because I believe, whether on ETH or Tezos, that is something that is very crucial to the lifeblood of this ecosystem we're all trying to build. You know,
Yes, and I think what you were saying earlier about the fact that for much of the art world, value of an art piece is situated in the context that it is presented in. And as exactly as you said, you know, if you put three trash bags in the
Yeah.
center of the MoMA, it will
Yeah.
be treated differently if it were outside the MoMA, or if you were to nail a banana to the wall, suddenly it becomes a transactable item
Right.
of vast significance. But then when you translate this idea or this principle onto the blockchain space and you see how art is appraised differently depending on where it is minted,
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because when you take a platform like Tezos and the very grassroots art communities that are represented there, particularly since the early beginnings of Hicket Nunk and now Taya, what you see is this emergence of a hugely diverse body of work from a hugely diverse community of artists, many of which came from emerging economies, namely Southeast Asia, you know, South America, and the like. And the fact that that art, despite the richness of its quality, would not garner the same level of value had it been minted elsewhere is something of a tragedy.
It
So,
is.
and I mean, yourself, you held a solo exhibition, Frequencies of Nostalgia, at Art Fair Philippines. And I mean, that must have been a huge moment. And it's one of the world's largest regional art show. It's a what? Sorry,
Art
one of
fair.
the largest regional art shows. And then at least there is justice in that your work is recognized regionally, like the impact that you are having is recognized. But I think what I'm driving my question towards, because I recognize that I'm running in circles here, is like, how do we really crystallize like the richness of the art ecosystems that are emerging in economies that are not considered the homes of high art? How do we demonstrate how much value there is and do it actual justice
You know,
without
it's yeah. That's a
forcing them to engage in the same rules of play that we've set up for the traditional art world that we are supposedly supposed to be breaking down with this blockchain based art world?
you know the irony. So just sort of like a quick digressing into like a quick kind of like side story. Um, a couple of artists and myself who've worked on our art careers IRL pre NFTs, for example, Amir Fala, Mark Dorf, Colette Robbins, all established artists within the traditional art world, traditional art backgrounds. We all came together to create organic material. It's an art collective we have, the four of us, and we sought out to like when we first got into Tezos, because we were so attracted to exactly that. It was to us, it was a very honest community of artists and creators, and we felt that there were these collectors that were open to learning about art history, because in ETH, at the time of the bull run, you mint some picture, whatever, some arbitrary thing, and it sells for 40 ETH, and you got your head scratching. Nobody talked about why. And that was kind of like one of the main reasons where we felt like perhaps those are the sort of like the branding challenges that NFTs have with the greater art, the greater art world, that they won't, we still have a long ways to go before I feel that the art world completely embraces NFTs, because it's had a branding problem, because it does have all of some of these sort of like scammy approaches to everything, and where art is sort of just um, it's a way for for them to give whatever financial how should instrument or asset that they were pumping at the time. But it really, it was kind of like a smoke and mirrors affair, instead of truly appreciating the art, which we felt that was on Tezos. And so our first drop, we did on Tezos, which is the first organic material drop. And then there was Art for Ukraine, in which we spearheaded ourselves in raising funds for Ukraine on the onset of the Ukrainian invasion. And so, yeah, so it's been a struggle, because unfortunately, here we are, four of us artists, um, some of us are in museum collections. Amir Fala himself, he a very prolific artist that has his work in many different museum permanent collections. um we are not sort of like in the radar of these kind of like massive whales kind of thing. Within the NFT culture, you have these funds and DAOs and whale groups that basically, you know they have this arbitrary way of choosing their like, as in the art world has their own darlings and whatnot. But our argument is that, in the art world, you've had a certain time for the art to mature, and you've had a certain time, like decades go by, um, because relevance is all about uh, what's the word, rel- to be constantly relevant, there has to be consensus, and therefore, you know to have consensus throughout decades is a very difficult thing, right? Because you may have been a big artist in the 70s or the 80s, but now, you know, many museums or whatnot don't even exhibit or talk about the work. And so, there's so many stages where I feel NFT is just an accelerated, like, people are trying so hard to push all of these new artworks into the LACMA, into, WAGMI, to the MoMA or whatever, to the moon, kind of, you know. And I think a lot of these people, and not to disparage, I feel have no art background because they don't know how these things work and that it takes time. And I think, you know, um, it's very difficult because, even the art world itself, it's a very exclusive world still. um and like, as you said, we were trying to sort of like use this. I believe during the bull run of 2021, it was a litmus test, an experiment to see how far we could take this culturally. I think within the small communities it's been massively successful because it showed that certain, you could create micro economies within it. But of course, sustainability is still a question, because at the end of the day, we still need patronage. These things have to be paid for. Art Fair Philippines is a massive undertaking to the founders, to the organizers. It needs sponsors, hence, like in art, it needs patronage.
Mhm.
And so, I think the question, boils down to how much of it is sustainable. How, we need, I think, there's a there's an inordinate amount of artists versus collectors. There's
Mhm.
not that many collectors, and so I think that is the main challenge. And even for Art Fair Philippines to be known to a international stage, it's quite the it's still quite the challenge, because you have, sort of like, colonial kind of like, countries, like, let's say, Hong Kong, for example. At the
Mhm.
time, um, it was more uh, sort of like a hub for, like, let's say, Art Basel to come to Hong Kong.
Mhm.
And the Philippines is just starting. And I think, there's something to be said, perhaps, about soft power. Perhaps, like, I think South Korea has been really good at, um, exporting their soft power within their pop music, like, K-pop and all that. And I think perhaps, that is a massive thing, a project that was given, support from their government. Many people
Mhm.
don't know, but I think perhaps, a country like the Philippines could
Yeah,
explore
it's
doing something similar.
it's sort of identifying how much social value certain elements of culture can really bring to the global stage, I guess. And I think what you were saying about, the patronage of different art realms is super interesting, because essentially what we have is traditional art and blockchain art worlds developing entirely different systems almost, but then somehow resulting with similar outputs, but then also wanting to be treated the same. And then
Yeah.
artists finding themselves very much caught in between. And then when we bring the cultural element, especially when it comes to representation, I think it adds a whole different dimension to the debate, because it's also how are we making sure that we are actually making the art world even more culturally rich than it has been. So, exactly as you said, I think, the platform creators that are within the blockchain space and supporting blockchain based artists, or those that are primarily known for their blockchain based works, are trying to break into the traditional art world, because it does provide them with a sense of legitimacy. And I think what Tezos did a fantastic job of was legitimizing many artists through the partnership with Art Basel, where Art
Yes.
Basel, being this very traditional realm for the art world, suddenly have this new technology age
Yes.
exhibition where
Yes. It's
artists from
exciting.
all over of very different disciplines, from very different backgrounds, are demonstrating, you know, the like their skills, or their richness as artists. I'm struggling to find the words for just like the quality of the work that was
Yeah.
exhibited there, because I was privileged enough to see both of the exhibitions that were put up, and just the sheer quality of the work and how different it was from everything else that was within the space was testament to how this was an arena that couldn't be ignored. But as you said, like the cultural element of the discourse can't be overlooked, because the spotlight that we shine, like we have to choose where we shine the spotlight. And
That's it.
I think because NFTs were very much in vogue for the last couple of years, it was easy to do so. But as you said, in smaller communities, there was a lot more that was going on than would ever hit that level. And so I think this is another very roundabout way of essentially asking you, as an artist who's based in the States but is culturally in many ways still Filipino,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the ways in which your work is recognized for the quality of the work itself, rather than it being necessarily testament to where
Yeah.
you come from and your cultural identity versus your artistic identity?
Yeah. This is I've wrestled with this so much, and I'm glad that you're addressing it because, and like for example, I briefly mentioned there's a recent documentary about Nanjun Paik by PBS, and I really loved watching it because Nam June Paik is like a very huge multimedia artist. Specifically, he is seen as a pioneer and an icon. And I very much, having discovered or learned about his story, um, I discover a lot of parallels between he and I, like our history, the 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 necessity to leaving your country, not because of, you know, uh, not because of you wanting to sort of like, you know, pursue this like, colonial lifestyle or whatever that you were bombarded with when you were a child, but just because that you felt that there was a better better opportunities elsewhere, in which what I did I landed myself in New York, and that's how I started my artistic journey. Same with him. And what's interesting is that you don't see any South Korean kind of like traces of South Korean culture in his artwork, except for sort of like the Zen Buddha, the TV Buddha that he's so famously known for. But even that, the way he positions the Buddha has nothing to do with him being Asian, you know. And none of the stuff in his work kind of like references his his citizenry, his citizenship, being born in South Korea, And same as with me, because most of, like, for a lot of the works that I've created, and for the past 20 years, um very few paintings, perhaps maybe some analog paintings, even give like a small a clue to me being Filipino, you know and because that I always feel like if you were just being honest with, exploring, your exploration as an artist, um I feel like it's almost like the your identity, as your nationality and whatnot, is almost it's almost fluid, because it's like now we have this talk about the metaverse and you being able to become anything you want and all that. Does nationality really matter and all that? I mean, of course it is, to some, if that is what you lean on to, or that is the sort of identity. Like, if identity is part of your work, then that makes a lot of sense. But for me, for the most part, you know um being nationalistic and all that, I understand that, although it's never been part of the work, like, I don't have any sort of, like, traces of any kind of Philippine culture within the work. Perhaps, if I go back to the Philippines for a certain time, if I do like an exhibition, because my current work is conceptually, um, it's more rooted in conceptual art. So then it makes sense to explore certain topics that are within a the Philippine culture, perhaps.
Do
But in
you
terms,
do you I would say, do you feel that there is often this unfair pressure to either root your work as a non Western artist into your culture and make that a core part of its purpose, or to decide to fold into the pressure to Westernize your work to specifically counter it being overly identified or tied to your nationality and culture?
no, I feel like it. I mean, it's really simple. I just want it to be sort of like a universal thing. It's like when you
Hmm.
see a specific word on a canvas or whatnot. It's an English word. It says chair. That has no boundaries or any kind of cultural significance, and that's kind of where I I I explore, or I play within these neutral, grounds, because I would like everyone, regardless of their nationality, to sort of like experience it. And like I said, it's not. I would imagine, like, let's say, if, like, for example, I guess it's the way I create the work in the mode of production. You don't see traces of culture within the mode of production. It's about the topics, I guess. Like, let's say if I
Hmm.
decide to create a collection that is responding to something politically or socially, then perhaps you'd see some of it. But I don't feel any kind of, like, you know, any kind of
Yeah.
pressure to, like, make it more appealing to a certain kind of audience or something. I want it to be sort of neutral as possible, so that it transcends all these kind of, like, cultural boundaries.
And that being said, do you feel that there is enough momentum and enthusiasm for Asia-based artists within the NFT space? And like, how do we make sure that that can thrive further, where, this notion of diversity in art isn't tied to the aesthetic or the cultural reflections in the aesthetic of the art piece
I understand
itself?
you. Yeah, like, for example, like, for me, I think it's very difficult. Like, I'm, as much as possible, when I do get my bit of time in the spotlight, if I'm being interviewed, for example, like now and all that, I always mention, the Philippine art community that exists, within the Tezos ecosystem. There's several artists that were in Art Fair Philippines, that were highlighted by the galleries and all. And you know they are, you know they are expressing, their culture and their experiences through their work, in which, because it's completely different. I mean, I'm sort of like a traveling expat, right? So my experiences are completely different. I mean, sure, like the I can respond to my feelings or my story as as an immigrant, which is completely different to somebody who's never left the country and is still
Mhm.
experiencing those themes. There's specific themes, cultural themes, and that's why, I always do my best to promote that, those, especially in written interviews. Like, let's say the written interviews, I give very detailed examples of all of these artists, and I try to promote them. And again, the it falls back on the galleries and the museums and the institutions to seek them out and to basically give them, the some time under the spotlight, give them some spotlight time. And I think
So,
that's the challenge.
so who are some of the other Asia-based artists that are minting on Tezos specifically that you feel need greater acknowledgement and recognition? Like if you were to take this moment in time to shine that spotlight on them, who are they?
Yeah, I would say, there's a bit of a longer list, but the two artists that basically, here's the thing, I do enjoy their work. uh, One criteria I would say, because there's so many that make beautiful work, right? But I feel that one of the criteria in truly um, kind of mentioning some people who are doing important work are those that are leaders and creating these communities, like like you know um, Bjorn Calleja and Jopet Arias are two artists who basically um, curated frequencies of nostalgia. But within the Philippine art scene, they have created their own Tezos community in the Philippines, and they regularly have meetings and they have educational seminars and presentations. And that is why I believe, like that's why I mentioned them, because I feel that they both, through their their tireless sort of way of promoting Tezos, and it's just incredible. Like, they've independently created these amazing communities, and without any uh, they're not they're not hoping to get something out of it, because it's like it's truly for the richness of the culture and all, and promoting other artists that are local that would never otherwise get any kind of recognition internationally.
Hmm. Well, Skye, I think you and I could probably talk for hours if left to it, but I do want to tie up our conversation here in the interest of the time that we have left. But before we do go, I'd like to ask if you can share sort of where people can find more material on you. So after they, finish listening to this conversation, they want to look a little bit more into your work. Where can they go?
Yeah, I would say follow me on socials. I think that's the best way to interact with me. If you're on Twitter at Skye Nicolas, if you're on Instagram at Skye Nicolas, um, and some of the work is on Expanded Art, which is a Berlin gallery led by Annika Meyer, curator, expanded.art. And some of the previous works that are also non NFT related, go to my website, skynicholas.com. And yeah, hopefully, I would love for your audience to reach out after this and have a dialogue with them. And hopefully, we can all really grow this community together and, get more people onboarded to Tezos.
Amazing. Well, Skye, thank you so much for your perspectives, and I really look forward to us speaking again,
Please,
hopefully
yeah,
very soon.
so much to discuss. Thank you so much, Marissa.
So much to discuss. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.